He was the son of a devout Lutheran family. Theology was his intended course of study until he studied philology at the University of Bonn. His father died when Nietzsche was 4 years old due to what was then known as softening of the brain. During his life, Nietzsche too suffered from debilitating headaches. In 1867, Nietzsche entered military service as an artillery officer. However, he was discharged due to injury. He was appointed to the chair of classical philology at the University of Basel in 1869 at 24 years old, and he was one of the youngest scholars ever to be appointed to such a position. Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy, published in 1871, was met with indignation from the academic community. These attacks confirmed Nietzsche's suspicions that professional scholarship was too politically motivated to accommodate his interests. He subsequently reduced his active service at the university and retired from the chair of philology at Basel. From 1871 onwards, Nietzsche gave up on academia and concentrated on the development of his philosophy. He was committed to the revitalization of culture, education, and society through the rejection of the dogmatic reception of tradition, and his work remains a model of philosophical inquiry into the development of modern intellectual opinion to this day. One of the most significant parts of Nietzsche's philosophy was the importance he placed on the role of education and teachers in society and the relationship to the development of culture. Nietzsche collapsed in 1888 and was bedridden from then until his death on the 25th of August 1900. He produced 11 major works dealing with many aspects of modern cultural and intellectual life, and many of his works are written as collections of essays. He wrote with a style and eloquence that has seldom been equaled. His work had immense influence both within and outside academic circles. Nietzsche's influence on education began to be exerted in the early part of the 20th century, and he has held the attention of educational thinkers ever since. His importance to pedagogical philosophy is best understood through an appreciation of his larger philosophical project and changes that occurred during the first half of the 19th century. He was concerned about the stagnation of intellectual life and the fragmentation of society through the increased emphasis on material wealth and comfort over cultural and social development. His cultural criticism was motivated by what he saw as the decline in education, the increasing professionalization of scholarship, and rising state control over both education and culture. In the first half of the 19th century, secondary schools and universities in Germany underwent a revolution. Old professional degrees of law, medicine, and theology were challenged for primacy by the humanities and natural sciences. Historically, the humanities or liberal arts were pursued out of a genuine interest in the development of human understanding. However, the nature of modern scholarship promoted an attitude of competitive academic work, which placed position and reputation in a more central role, one that Nietzsche felt was contrary to the true objectives of education. The effect of this was the fragmentation between the various disciplines and various specialties within each discipline. The overriding tone in Nietzsche's work during the early period up to 1867 is frustration, and this drove his desire to develop a pedagogical philosophy which could accommodate his objectives. After this period, he became concerned with the repair of the situation, which led to the development of his well-known method of criticism, genealogical analysis, and reconstruction. Insofar as Nietzsche sought to understand the development of these negative forces in society, education took a central role in his whole philosophical project. Underlying Nietzsche's philosophy of education is the notion of higher culture and true education. He believed that contemporary culture was Philistine. Philistine culture was the creator of whole philosophies, the sole proviso of which is that everything must remain as it was before, that nothing should undermine the rational and real, that is to say, the Philistine. When academic endeavor is defined by those with little or no vision or initiative, education becomes a lifeless process of transferring a body of facts rather than developing human understanding. Nietzsche believed this was in part due to the decline of linguistic education. Too much emphasis was placed on the development of specialized interests within a field of study at the expense of the scholar's ability to convey conclusions in an articulate and concise manner. The central role Nietzsche placed on language was presented in a series of 5 public lectures titled "On the Future of Our Educational Institution." In these public lectures, he outlined the shortcomings of the German educational system. Nietzsche believed that education had been degraded by its subordination to the state and had become composed of 2 detrimental forces which combined to destroy education and thereby culture as well. 1. The greatest possible expansion of education, and 2. The narrowing and weakening of it. Nietzsche believed that emphasis ought to be placed on strict instruction and guidance. The student must be given the tools and guidance to develop abilities rather than being handed an image to imitate. The ultimate goal of Nietzsche's philosophy of education and whole philosophical system is the development of true culture through the production of fully authentic individuals, or what he called the higher type of humanity. Through the production of such individuals, all of society would find its justification and so reap the greatest rewards. Nietzsche's educational philosophy is concerned in essence with the future. He was a harsh critic of values of modern society, and he felt that these were responsible for the modern sense of dislocation and isolation. He could make no sense of cultural and human progress unless it was the result of the critical assessment of the past. This is to be done by deciding what ought to be maintained for its useful and beneficial nature with regard to the continued development of the individual, and so, through the individual, the whole of society. The goal of education, in Nietzsche's opinion, was the production of true culture and higher types, free spirits, and eventually the Overman. These are individuals possessed of the ability to decide for themselves what has value and what does not, without reliance on the dogmatic reception of tradition. The highest form of life is the fully authentic individual who understands that the illusions and necessary fictions of which he is author are the ones that are right for him, and that not everyone is capable of flourishing in the same way under the same conditions. Nietzsche believed that modern society could be characterized by its lack of authenticity. The drive towards ever greater material wealth and comfort creates a leveling effect, which in turn precipitates the stagnation of all culture, education included. This leveling effect results in a desire to have every individual place the same values on the same things, and so to eradicate the individual altogether. This is one of the most important attitudes that Nietzsche worked against, since its only outcome is nihilism, the feeling that since everything has the same value for everyone, nothing has any appreciable value at all. It is precisely here that Nietzsche's educational philosophy gains its greatest importance, for he held that the purposes of education were the same as those of society, and as such, if society decides that there is no appreciable value to anything, education, in the sense of development and progress, becomes equally meaningless. Nietzsche emphasized the importance of the formation of authentic individuals through, on the one hand, self-reflection and the critical analysis of one's true educators, and on the other, through a strong and strict educational system capable of re-establishing the ability of the individual to posit value, and thereby re-establishing society's ability to do the same. The attainment of the goals of this form of education are what gives sense to or justifies the society we create. This true education, by definition, is not within the realm of possibility for everyone. It is for the few. The majority, or herd, require a different type of education, that is, one that provides them with the ability to sustain themselves. However, this is not any less valuable because it too will allow those individuals to attain their highest possible level of authenticity. Nietzsche's argument is that full authenticity requires sacrifice and commitment on a scale that is exceptionally rare. For Nietzsche, there were very few individuals who could be said to have approached the status of the higher type. No overman has yet walked the earth. This status should not be mistaken for that of the hereditary aristocracy, since when he says noble, Nietzsche is not speaking of the little word von. He is rather speaking of an aristocracy of spirit and intellect, which is to say that anyone who aspires to greater authenticity ought to be able to access the means to that development. It is therefore not one's birthright, but one's convictions, attitudes, and interests that are important. Nietzsche held that a society's interest in such higher types was the same as a concern for all of society. The idea is that we are as great as our greatest examples, and in that sense they justify us. For example, Julius Caesar, Pericles, or Napoleon, as examples of their society's highest values, are identified with Rome, Athens, and France. For Nietzsche, a society is to be judged by the quality of its educational goals and its insistence on the attainment of those goals. On the basis of such educational aims, the social, political, and economic structure of society will be geared towards its own development in a more authentic manner. When this relationship is reversed, progress becomes synonymous with economic growth and technological advance, and this in turn perpetuates the leveling effect, which is contrary to authentic individuals and lives. Although during his lifetime Nietzsche occupied the periphery of the intellectual community, his influence has steadily increased since his death. His philosophy resists the standard approach of dissection and categorization. The standard approach of dissection and categorization led to some misinterpretations of his philosophy, most notably the Nazi distortions of some of Nietzsche's key concepts for the purpose of justifying their own practices and policies. While Nietzsche did write only 3 works that deal specifically with education, to take these as his complete pedagogical philosophy would be to fall into the nearsightedness which he devoted himself to correcting. Education is a central theme in Nietzsche's work from the time of his first autobiography at the age of 14 through to his last works. His approach to education came at a time when modern educational systems were first coming into being, and it stood as a warning. Unfortunately ignored during his own time, his work is becoming more and more recognized as important in all of the subjects to which he directed his extraordinary intellect. His thought has had foundational influence on existentialism, critical and literary theory, and postmodernism during the 20th century. Time has done little to reduce the relevance of his approach, his analysis, and his conclusions.